So yeah, I'm going to go through and go cover how remote work is driving the need for multi-cloud DevSecOps. And to give you a little bit of background about myself, so I'm ex-Air Force, prior cybersecurity practitioner in the Air Force, and have come over to the other side in software engineering. I have my own DevSecOps automation company. I have spoke at various events out there, including All Day DevOps, which was actually published in Feedback Loops Volume 2, awesome event, and some others. I was at HashiCorp last year too at a lightning talk. And I kind of want to cover today on bridging the gap between cybersecurity and DevOps, and really focusing in on the fact that not only is remote work driving us to look at the different cloud providers out there and how that'll map to what we're trying to accomplish when it comes to DevSecOps, but also the fact that we're really looking at a issue out there with a talent shortage in cybersecurity and DevOps, and also, how do we solve the issue with not just multi-cloud, but also kind of moving to other terms like polycloud too, using multiple cloud services and different cloud providers, and really making the solution and driving the outcomes that every organization is looking for, and also bridging this gap between cybersecurity and DevOps to really hone in on the problem, which is how do I bake security into DevOps or DevSecOps pipelines, and also how do I strategize around multi-cloud. So really, it's starting out with DevSecOps. What is DevSecOps? And over 10 years ago, DevOps added agile infrastructure as code to agile software development. And DevSecOps is really about adding agile security as code to DevOps. And really, I look at it holistically as having multiple teams involved, including the cybersecurity team. And how do we drive the fact that cybersecurity teams need to not only be a part of the dev process, but also looking at if things are becoming software defined, how do we get them into pipelining processes? How do we enable organizations by leveraging different cloud providers, and then having that in a modular type of approach to be able to ensure that over time you can pick the best cloud services for your DevSecOps pipelining process, and also looking at the different cybersecurity tools that you can add into the process as well. So from that standpoint, I've come up with a term called IT as code, and I love this tweet back from 2017 of the OSI model and every layer being software, and really look at if it's software or code or software defined, you should be able to fit it into a DevSecOps pipelining process, and also looking at how do you drive multi-cloud capabilities around infrastructure as code using products like Terraform, configuration as code, products like Ansible, and then security as code. There's a lot of tools coming out there to be able to add security into your pipelining process, and also looking at how do I incorporate that into my DevSecOps pipelining process and ensure that over time I can modularly build in capabilities and try to future-proof what I'm building from a pipelining perspective. So I like to kind of go over the principles that I look at of DevSecOps, and really it's kind of honing in on a lot of the practices from the cybersecurity side are still manual. There are still manual handoffs. As a cybersecurity practitioner for almost 20 years now, I still see a lot of manual processes in 2021. And we really want to be able to stop going from a manual handoff to a continuous automation process, and incorporating the various tools that we're used to from a cybersecurity standpoint into our DevOps and DevSecOps pipelining processes. The second piece is, instead of manually responding to alerts and events, we create automation that cuts down on labor overhead and human error. And it's really important to think about that from a cybersecurity perspective. And as we're adding different cybersecurity use cases into our pipelining process, what tools are we using? How can we cut down and create repeatability, which is super important. The third one is, instead of being reactive, we are proactive, using agile approach for every cybersecurity use case we can bring in. So whether it's AppSec that we're adding SAST and DAST or IIS scans to a pipelining process, or we're trying to do more stuff around infrastructure scanning, IAC scanning, even remediation, how do we add that into the pipelining process? And also looking at the different technologies and third-party cybersecurity vendors, the tools and products that they have to, again, incorporate them into a pipelining process. And the fourth one is, instead of configuring security manually, we seamlessly integrate cybersecurity into existing agile IT, and that can be anything from cloud management platforms to DevOps workflows for anything you're doing on the CI/CD front, and really looking at how do I incorporate these different tools into the process? How can I use them on multiple cloud providers? And how can I drive success in my organization in a world where we're trying to push as hard to using multiple cloud providers because of the driving factors behind remote work that is really the catalyst towards what we're seeing as the adoption and push towards more of a DevSecOps process. So in order to shift cybersecurity left, we really have to focus on the existing cybersecurity use cases. And again, that can be anything from adding AppSec scanning into your pipelining process to more modern approaches around being able to do container scanning, being able to scan for vulnerabilities against infrastructure as code, things like that. And looking at what tools am I going to be adding into my pipelining process, and thinking about the entire life cycle of what you're building from a pipelining process. So when you're adding the Sec and DevSecOps, it's really about honing in and also making every use case a reusable pipeline that you can tie either into existing pipelines or looking at new greenfield pipelines that you want to be able to build from scratch. Thinking also from a solution standpoint, how you're going to build a pipeline that you can have that can run against different cloud providers. So you may have to make some specific around infrastructure as code, running them against each cloud provider. But then when you're incorporating the security pipelines into the mix, you want to think about how those can be utilized against different services on the cloud provider side, and also how far left you can shift in order to be able to add scans all the way back to not just the source code, but also scanning infrastructure as code and trying to get as far left into the process as possible, and being able to incorporate those pipelines as early as possible into your overall pipelining process, and building your pipeline modularly so that you have the ability to swap out pipelines as components over time. The other thing I would hone in on is there's really thinking about pipelines end to end. You're really trying to build a overall solution. So it may be for software delivery, but I'm seeing a lot of different use cases out there focused on being able to also enable the cybersecurity teams to work with development and DevOps teams, and how those pipelines can be incorporated more into solution delivery. So it's not just about building a software delivery pipeline, it's really about looking at how can I incorporate more value and build more sophisticated pipelines to drive solution delivery. And the last piece I would hone in on is really thinking about how each pipeline is created. And if you can decouple it from any dependencies on a specific cloud provider, and you can use it on multiple clouds, you'll be able to hone in on, okay, if I can scan a Terraform configuration or a Kubernetes config, or any sort of things from IAC scanning to scanning actual hardware, running remediation content, looking at how that can be run against different infrastructure on each of the cloud providers. So that way you can create repeatability with the cybersecurity use cases that you are building out, so that you can have them inside of your pipelining process. And it's super critical to think about this as you're building out your solutions, and how you can have those pipelines work in isolation, and then also have them utilized in a broader pipelining process. And so as you're building these out over time, you want to think about, hey, how am I building out a pipeline that maps to a particular cybersecurity vendor's tool? Is there an open source tool that I can use inside of that pipeline? Do I have to build it towards some sort of commercial offering that I'm going to have to tie into? And also, do I need to have multiple tools in that process as well? And can they work on each of the major cloud providers from AWS, Azure, Google, and others? So you really want to be honing in on what that means and how you can incorporate these particular pipelines, cybersecurity focused pipelines, into a broader pipelining practice. So when you're looking for a cloud architecture, you really want to hone in on a holistic view of how, not just how you're going to create multi-cloud pipelines and focusing on building these DevSecOps pipelines, but also where can you execute these pipelines? Can they be executed in different cloud providers? I see a lot of customers out there that are multi-cloud, but they also want to be able to not just spin up the services, but be able to execute the pipelines and the automation content in each of the cloud providers. So you want to think about how you're building out your CI/CD type of approach when it comes to the platform you're going to select, and then how those pipelines and automation can be a content that can be used and executed. And also, can I use the same tools like Terraform or Ansible or Vault, both on each of the cloud providers, but also looking at it from an on-premise perspective too, because you may have a private cloud as well that you want to be able to run these DevSecOps pipelines against. So overall, it's really about holistically looking at the big picture, how you're building these pipelines, and putting some planning into, again, the different tools, the automation content you're creating, and then also the pipelines that are actually going to run these tools and automation together as you're building them out, and how you can build them into larger, more sophisticated pipelines that can be really solution driven, so that you have the ability to have all of this content in a repeatable process. So when we look at example DevSecOps pipelining processes, really want to hone in on different use cases. So this particular use case is a compliance use case. And so at the very beginning of it, we're looking at, we want to scan IAC. You may look at using products like Bridgecrew's Checkov or Accurics Terrascan, or whatever you're using from an IAC scanning perspective, and shifting as far to the left as you can to incorporate scanning for vulnerabilities in at the beginning of your pipelining process. And then looking also at building the capabilities around being able to pull secrets or credentials from something like HashiCorp Vault, and being able to use that with different cloud providers when you're building out the infrastructure, and then figuring out how you're going to pick and choose the different cloud services on each of the cloud providers, and how that's going to work towards the overall pipeline that you're trying to build. And then also thinking about the other steps inside of your pipelining process that you're going to incorporate. So I may want to be able to send out a Slack message, or open a ServiceNow ticket, or send out or tie into Teams. And so you really want to think about how you're incorporating these different steps into your pipelining process and creating reusability. Because at the end of the day, it's about being able to incorporate these cybersecurity use cases into the process, and also looking at the different tools that you want to add into your process as well. So from a standpoint of everything from remediation to assessment, so if I want to run remediation, is there content available out there? Am I running it against, more like IaaS operating systems on the cloud providers? Can I run that against each of the major cloud providers' virtual machine instances? Can I use that same content to remediate against, say, a Kubernetes cluster? Is it a managed Kubernetes cluster? Is it do I control the whole thing? And so you really want to hone in also on, as you're building out these different steps, can I use those particular tools, and for remediation stuff like Ansible playbooks and roles in the process, and then incorporating other tools like Syscat Assessor or OpenSCAP to be able to run the assessments in the process. And then also looking at, do I want to use open source tools? Do I want to use third-party commercial tools? What makes sense? I see organizations using multiple tools in the process too, so they may use something like OpenSCAP or Syscat Assessor, but they may add in other tools like Tenable or Qualys, or whatever, you can fill in the gap. And so the goal there is that you create everything from a modular perspective, so that you can swap out or even add additional scans to your process. And really, at the end of the day, it's really about getting the visibility and having the capabilities around the remediation process. So you really can hone in on, what am I trying to accomplish in this particular pipeline? How am I trying to incorporate security at each step inside the pipeline? Can I give visibility to multiple teams, and really start enabling collaboration across the board as you're building these out? Because each one of these can be decoupled and run by itself, and then being able to chain them into a larger pipelining process to get more of an end result type of solution so that you can build more complicated pipelines, but in a modular way, really incorporating what you need as a organization to be able to accomplish. So the end result of a pipeline like this is really to be able to harden, say, images that you may want to use in other pipelining process, and having a process to be able to harden and secure your infrastructure against different things like the CIS benchmarks, which is super critical to be able to map them to whatever compliance framework that you're trying to map to, whether that's NIST 853 or whatever you're looking at trying to do as an organization. You really want to hone in on the particular tools that you're using. And then there's a lot of tools out there that are really still immature. So stuff like infrastructure as code scanning, that's still kind of a maturing area of the market. And so there's definitely coverage for stuff like Terraform and Kubernetes and CloudFormation, and they're adding more and more support. But you want to look at what's going to make sense for coverage there, so that you can have things from a policy standpoint, but also a vulnerability standpoint, to make sure that you have as much coverage at every single stage in your pipelining process when it comes to incorporating various cybersecurity tools into the process, and really kind of getting the end result of what type of use case are you trying to build this pipelining process against. Is it compliance? Are you trying to do infrastructure automation where you just want to build the controls in? Like, what are you trying to do in that process? You got to answer that question. The second piece is looking at the different tools that you already have and seeing if they are something that you can incorporate into the process. And the third piece is looking kind of to the future and what you're trying to modernize towards as well. So if you want to be able to add in, container security and be able to use other tools in the process, or being able to incorporate other vulnerability scanners, or whatever it may be, just looking at those and assessing what can actually be added into your DevSecOps pipelining process. And again, really honing in on how you can leverage the same pipelines against different cloud providers so that you don't have dependencies on that particular cloud provider. So if the particular pipeline that you have for AWS or Azure is building the infrastructure, then you can have all the other pieces of the pipeline completely decoupled and ability to use those against the different cloud providers. So it's really critical to plan on the front end and also start small. So even if you start with one cloud provider, again, thinking about how you're building out your pipelines and what that means for your organization and how you can create repeatability. So the other piece I'd hone in on is collaboration between cybersecurity and DevOps teams. So it's really critical to be able to have various use cases around stuff like AppSec, container scanning, cloud security, and so on, to be able to incorporate those into your existing CI/CD pipelining processes. So you really want to hone in on at what stage of your build or your DevOps workflow do you need to incorporate different types of cybersecurity tools into the mix. So is it something like application security where I need to run SonarQube or check marks, or do I need to run remediation content and there's some available out there in some Git repo? Can I add those into my process and be able to trigger those at some point inside of my process? And also thinking about how you're able to enable collaboration with your cybersecurity team. So it's give them visibility to security and compliance dashboards, but also start making it easier for them to have a seat at the table and actually collaborate together. Because truly, to achieve DevSecOps, it's not about finding the unicorn DevSecOps engineers out there. It's really about driving the overall collaboration between Dev, Sec, and Ops, and really looking at how I can incorporate different cybersecurity use cases into my existing processes, and also looking at greenfield use cases too. I go into a lot of organizations and I see, people are just getting started with using, Terraform and Vault and so on, and how they're trying to incorporate that into an existing use case like identity and access management, and being able to, how do I take that and add that particular use case around infrastructure automation into a broader solution that can be delivered to your end users? And what does that look like from a, again, multi-cloud perspective? So how can I create that to be able to utilize that against different cloud providers? And I'm also seeing a lot of organizations looking at different cloud services and different cloud providers. So I may use, Azure AD because I'm a, it was a Microsoft shop, and I needed to use that for identity and access management. But then I'm incorporating that into what the devs have spun up in, say, AWS, and maybe they have, EKS, managed Kubernetes clusters, or using EC2 instances. And so looking at how you're building out your pipelining process that maps to these different cybersecurity use cases, and also looking at the different tools that you'll be adding in. So what does it make sense to add in an open source tool like Aqua Security Trivi that it can do container and source code scanning? Am I going to incorporate that in at a particular stage in my my CI/CD process? And then also, what does that look like to be able to get cybersecurity a part of that process? Can they incorporate some of these use cases into what my dev and DevOps team is already implementing? And then at the end result is, can I utilize those pipelines both on different cloud providers, but also in my own private cloud? A lot of organizations still have private cloud implementations, on VMware or Microsoft a suite of products. And so, can you utilize the pipelines that you're creating on there, and then also the particular offering that you're choosing to be able to build out your CI/CD? Does it also work across multiple cloud providers? So you want to look at and assess, does that make sense? And then also really honing in on some of the other tools around compliance assessment and how those can be incorporated into your process too. So I'm seeing a lot of organizations, incorporating open source tools like OpenSCAP, but also looking at, can I incorporate third-party commercial products like, Tenable, Nessus, or Qualys into the process too. But again, not just as a point solution just to do scanning around vulnerabilities, but building it into a broader type of solution delivery that can chain multiple cybersecurity use cases together and incorporate those into your existing CI/CD workflows, which is super important. And the last thing I would hone in on is really looking at the mixture between the different services on the cloud providers too, and then also if you're using third-party SaaS-based applications too. So how am I incorporating those into my pipelining process? Am I tying in via an API? Am I using some sort of CLI tool? Like, what am I doing in that process, and how am I incorporating those in? And then can I leverage existing tools I already have, like Terraform or Vault and so on, to be able to incorporate those into the process too? So it's really about figuring out which tools you want, how those can map to the particular cybersecurity use cases that you're trying to incorporate into your process, and then figuring out at what stage of the process does it make sense to add those in to ensure that you have the cybersecurity coverage to really achieve what we're trying to in DevSecOps, which is really having security built into your pipelining process. So it's no longer decoupled from the process. It's really something that's can be tied right into where it makes sense inside of your process. So from a real world perspective, we really like to look at making sure that if you're trying to achieve multi-cloud DevSecOps and looking at what that means from a security perspective, you really want to make sure that security tools are built into each step of the process, and then being able to leverage various tools that you're trying to incorporate and the content and the automation content you're incorporating in, so that you can have security built in at every single stage of the process. So this is a pipeline that maps to the one I was showing on the prior slide, that's showing the cybersecurity steps built in, from the infrastructure scanning to being able to pull in credentialing from Vault, running Terraform, and then running remediation and an assessment with Syscat Assessor, a tool by CIS to run CIS assessment or benchmark assessments. And it's about each stage having the cybersecurity tools built in so that you can have them right in your pipelining process. The second piece to summarize is building modular pipelines. So it's all about making sure that you can create modular, repeatable pipelines that you can use in your pipelining process, so that you can incorporate these modular cybersecurity pipelines into your existing pipelining process, or even building net new processes to really ensure that you have the security steps built into your overall pipelining process. the third one is multi-cloud. So really thinking about, again, how you're building these pipelines that can work on multiple cloud providers. So even if you're decoupling, say, the infrastructure part, the infrastructure as code part, being able to look at all the other pieces that you have in your pipeline and making sure and ensuring that they can work on multiple cloud providers so that you create these repeatable pipelines that you don't have to, that you can just continue to reuse over and over again. And the last piece that I would hone in on is really focusing in on collaboration. So it's really key to be able to build your pipelines that can have multiple teams a part of the process. It's really difficult, again, to find the unicorns in the rough, the DevSecOps engineers out there. They exist, but they're in very short supply and high demand. And so it's really about having various cybersecurity, dev and DevOps team, even cloud architects and other teams that your organization may have, being able to collaborate together and actually build DevSecOps pipelines that not only work on multiple clouds, but also having each of the teams being able to contribute to build more of a solution delivery type of approach when it comes to building your DevSecOps pipelining process, which is super critical. And then also thinking about all the other business tools or other process, how you're tying this into other processes too. So I see other organizations, they'll build out a pipelining process and they may want to tie it into their sales process. So they'll tie it into Salesforce, or they want to be able to even tie it into some of the stuff on the IT side, like ServiceNow, or the example here with Slack. So being able to just think about that from a collaboration standpoint too. Are you using the same tools and applications to be able to push collaboration for each of the teams to not just have visibility, but also be able to contribute to the pipeline building process, which is super critical and necessary, because it's really about breaking down the overall silos out there. And it's a very cliche thing to say, but it's a reality out there, and really being able to have the different teams working together within the same tools and technologies, and then taking responsibility and actually being able to contribute as you're on your DevSecOps journey, and being able to, again, kind of honing in on being able to drive overall collaboration when it comes to this type of approach. So I'm just about at time, but you can reach me at IT as Code. I'm also on LinkedIn as IT as Code. If you have any questions around DevSecOps, I'm always available, and just a tweet or an email away. And really appreciate the time today, and thanks for having me.